Welcome to the 16th annual, but first, and we really hope only, Virtual Graduate Research Symposium Awards ceremony. I'm Quentin Williams, Acting Vice Provost and Dean of the Division of Graduate Studies, and we're the division that hosts this symposium. In a normal academic year, this symposium would take place at McHenry Library on the Friday of Alumni Weekend, which is, of course, canceled. So this symposium is designed to offer graduate students in every program the opportunity to present their work, their research, their art, to visiting alumni, the campus, and the Santa Cruz community. And it also offers the public the opportunity to learn about this work at our free and open event. In a normal year, visitors to the symposium at the library would be able to roam about, to view large posters, attend short talks, and check out alternative media presentations. You'd also get refreshments. So visitors would be able to do all this alongside judges and hear judges' questions and the graduate students' answers to enhance the understanding of the work that they're displaying. But this is, of course, a really unusual conclusion of this academic year because of COVID-19. Like all instruction, events, including this symposium, must be held online. So our symposium really isn't what I would call a symposium per se. The public and students themselves couldn't browse through the presentations in the various format media as in years past. Instead, we had to make do with Zoom as we are now. Earlier today, the graduate students who participated in this event held private Zoom meetings with their assigned judges because Zoom is the way we do things these days. And you couldn't experience their presentations live. But participants recorded their meetings and the graduate division will upload them to our YouTube channel soon. When they're available, we'll notify those of you who registered for this webinar. And after I announce each winner, we'll play that winner's recorded Zoom presentation. Thanks so much. And before I announce the winners, I'll extend gratitude to our prize sponsors. Thank you to the Arts Division, the Baskin School of Engineering, the Humanities Division, the Physical and Biological Sciences Division, and the Social Sciences Division for sponsoring the $250 prizes for the Best of Division winners. And thank you to Anna Scher, Assistant Director of Institutional Research, Assessment and Policy Studies, for providing the judging rubric and helping us finally parse the judges' scores by totals and averages to determine our winners. A special thank you to our volunteer judges, and thank you especially to this year's graduate student participants. Without further ado, the winners are
John Cage was born in 1912 and died in 1992. He's considered one of the most important American experimental composers of the 20th century, but he had a variety of interests and connected with many people outside of the music field. A known fact in Cage studies that is often mentioned but at the same time neglected is his interest in mushrooms. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, Cage amassed an impressive library of mycological texts. In fact, his curiosity with the subject was so strong that he revived the defunct New York Mycological Society in 1962. As you can see by this photo, there's Cage with the first meeting of the Mycological Society. In 1963, Cage began a lecture series for the Mycological Society where he invited W. Stephen Thomas, who was the president of the Thoreau Society, to give a lecture which he titled Henry David Thoreau, Amateur Mycologist. And he invited a lot of people. When I go through the archives, I find one of the kind of interesting dialogues was between Rachel Carson and John Cage, but she was really busy that year and politely declined that invitation. On your right, you can see that Cage by 1966 became an honorary member of the New York Mycological Society. He really rebuilt the society in many ways. But by 1964, Cage was given the North American Mycological Association's Award for Contributions to Amateur Mycology, which is really given annually to recognize a person who's contributed extraordinarily to the advancement of amateur mycology. In 1965, UC Santa Cruz was born as an answer to California's post-war baby boom and to the criticism of the UC system being seen as a large and impersonal or more interested in research than teaching university. The concept between UC Santa Cruz was considered innovative at the time as it consists of small, semi-autonomous colleges where students lived and studied together in contemporary residencies. In this non-traditional environment, an experimental arts workshop was conceived in 1969. This new program brought avant-garde artists such as John Cage, Merce Cunningham, Alan Capro, George Machunas, and George Chagall to perform and also lecture on education. This was Cage's first connection to the university. When Cage would visit UC Santa Cruz, he'd go foraging for mushrooms with two people. The first was Norman O. Brown, an influential humanities professor. They both met at Wesleyan University in 1960 before Brown was hired in UC Santa Cruz in 1968. The second was Alan Chadwick. I'm sure most of us are familiar with the Chadwick Gardens. Chadwick was a pioneering horticulturalist and worked in UC Santa Cruz from 1967 through 1972. Brown introduced the two, and in 1969, Cage spent a day hunting mushrooms with Chadwick and was immediately inspired by his work. Cage was so impressed that he later wrote about Chadwick and his students, "These people live, others haven't even been born." He was really referring to the community's innovative gardening techniques while also referencing UC Santa Cruz's unconventional approach to education. By 1971, Cage became so busy teaching, giving interviews, touring, and writing music and poetry that he needed to store his collection. His thriving relationship with UC Santa Cruz, mixed with his foraging experiences, made UC Santa Cruz the most suitable place for this material. Unfortunately, in current scholarship, when Cage donated his archive, scholars suggest that from the 1970s onwards, he'd given up on mycology. While Cage may have not been as involved in the Mycological Society after the 1970s, his correspondence flourished. He received copious amounts of mail where various scholars and artists referred to him for his mycological knowledge, sent him new information on the field, or simply sent him nice messages. For example, in 1975, the California-based artist Claudia Chaplin sent Cage an old drawing of a mushroom, telling him of her appreciation of his work. Further, Sabina Leibner, a pianist known for playing new music, sent Cage an article informing him of the dangers when foraging in Germany after the Chernobyl disaster of 1986. Also, you can see there's a nice happy birthday message from his publisher in New York City, Don Gillespie, on that also. So this 15-box collection in the UC Santa Cruz archive is one of three main places that Cage's materials exist, and the only one that specifically has most of his mycological collection. I've given a brief introduction to Cage, mycology, and the special collections. Unfortunately, little scholarship has been dedicated to this topic, but its rich context provides a new forum for further discussion. In conclusion, by conducting research on this subject, I will publish several articles in various journals. By doing this, I will fill a lacuna in the musicological literature and also promote awareness of not only this collection, but of the many gems we have here in our local university library. Thank you.
I'm Vishal Chakraborty. I'm a PhD student in the Computer Science and Engineering department, and I'm going to talk about possible winners on partial chains. My research falls under computational social choice, and it's in the confluence of computer science and social choice theory. Social choice theory dates back to 15th century, with pioneers like German philosopher and theologian Nicolas of Cusa and French mathematician Jean-Charles de Borda. ComSoc uses algorithmic concepts of computer science to study two things: election mechanisms and fair allocation of resources. My research falls under election mechanisms and manipulation. So let's look at an example. Imagine you and your friend are going to vote in a local election where you need to rank all candidates from most favorite to least favorite. There are three candidates on the ballot: Lizzie, Bernard, and Don. And you indicate your ranking of these candidates. However, your friend is having some difficulties. They are not sure how to rank these candidates. However, they know that Bernard is their most favorite candidate. In my research, I'm interested in these incomplete ballots. So the election is done and the votes are in. Lizzie's camp wants to know if Lizzie can win the election. More precisely, they ask the question if they can complete the incomplete ballots in a way which makes Lizzie the winner. Formally, this problem is known as the possible winner problem. It was introduced by Cognac and Lang in 2005. So let's take a look at what we are given. We have a set of candidates or alternatives. We have a set of incomplete votes or ballots, and we have a scoring rule. Let's take a small digression and understand what scoring rules are. Simply put, scoring rules are a way to assign points to ranked alternatives or candidates. Simple majority is perhaps the most commonly known rule. There are other important rules. The first one is plurality. In plurality, the first candidate gets a point, and all other candidates gets no points. The next example is board account. In board account, say there are M candidates. The rank 1 candidate gets M points. The second ranked candidates gets M minus 1 points, and so on. The last candidate gets only 1 point. Let's look at a quick example. As you can see, each row on this table represents a rankings of the candidates available. The rank 1 candidate gets 1 point, which is in green, and the other candidates gets no points, and the points are in 0. We compute the total number of points made by these candidates. And the winner is the candidate with the maximum number of points. As you can see on this example, the winner is Lizzie with 2 points. Now let's go back to the possible winner problem definition. Recall that we had a set of candidates, a set of incomplete votes, and scoring rule. Given these, we asked the question, is candidate C a possible winner or not? In the example we started with, Lizzie was this candidate C. So my work is on possible winners on a special kind of incomplete vote called partial chains. What are partial chains? Think of Netflix. Any user have watched only a finite subset of all the movies available on Netflix. And so they can rank only these movies which they have watched. From Netflix perspective, this ranking is incomplete. Such a ranking is called a partial chain. In my work, I provide a complete classification of the possible winner problem on these special kinds of incomplete orders called partial chains. In particular, I classify that plurality and veto scoring rules are computationally easy. But for all other rules, the possible winner problem on partial chains is computationally difficult. Computationally hard, NP complete, these are technical terms, but for now, we'll just stick to hard. Now, the next logical question is, you have proved that a problem is hard. What's next? Well, one of my ongoing work is how to solve this difficult problem in the most efficient way possible. Now you might ask, why are we talking about this? What makes this relevant? Well, let's conclude the talk by seeing some applications of the possible winner problem on partial chains. Imagine now that instead of human beings, the candidates are movies on YouTube, restaurants on Yelp, and products on Amazon. And the voters are simply the users or the subscribers on these websites. As you can see, the possible winner problem shows up frequently in the e-commerce, entertainment, and service industry. And thus, it's extremely relevant today. Thank you for your time.
Hello, my name is Taylor Krupa, and my graduate student research is called Stereotyping the Stereo, Sound, Space, Race, and Technology in New York City from the 1970s to the 1980s. So in 1976, a journalist for the New York Times wrote how the streets and subways of New York City were alive with the sound of music. Soul, disco, Latin rhythms, even underground, there's music in the air. These sounds were produced by one of the most popular portable audio listening devices at the time, the portable radio, more commonly known as the boombox. Hearing noises in public isn't new for any New Yorker, but that doesn't mean that the boombox fully escaped public critique. In 1977, another Times journalist described the sounds he heard on modern transit as a blare of shrieking sound that seems rarely tuned in expertly enough to be criticized as music. He wrote how the nervous passengers of buses and subways may now have their slim mental balances destroyed by young men with radios. The tension between boombox users and the public seemed apparent, but Joseph Raymond of the Wall Street Journal spared no subtlety in his racialized disdain of the portable radio owner. Nobody ever asks the fellow who totes it to turn it off, he wrote. That's because he's usually 8 feet tall and weighs 400 pounds. If he's small, he's generally believed to conceal a knife in one pocket and a zip gun in the other. Joseph was not alone in his racialized and classist stereotype of boomboxes and their users. In fact, these stereotypes were so common and pervasive, they are reflected by some of the portable radio's nicknames, such as beatboxes, ghetto blasters, and even the transnational Brixton briefcase. With my time as a graduate student of history at UC Santa Cruz, I have accumulated a tremendous collection of primary sources, including newspaper articles, op-eds, interviews, and advertisements surrounding portable audio technology in New York City. I argue that this type of media coverage not only reflected, but also began informing city residents' perceptions of the relationships between audio technologies, race, class, and crime. The perceptions of these technologies and their users would affect more than just the public's opinion of audio listening devices. They would also eventually impact the way urban spaces and soundscapes were perceived, and most importantly, policed.
Sorry, Taylor, just a quick question. Were you going to show us a presentation, or was there a presentation attached? We just wanted to make sure we didn't miss it.
No, there's not. It's just,
perfect. Perfect. Awesome.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So I found that the biases in Boombox's media coverage becomes even more apparent after the American debut of one of its most popular successors, the Sony Walkman. By 1981, just a year after its introduction in the American market, the Walkman became a status symbol for the affluent social elite. The device was seen in media ads for everything, from cassettes to 7-Up to even Seagram 7. In an interview, Andy Warhol gushed about how much more pleasant a walk through Manhattan is listening to opera as opposed to car horns. One New Yorker told a reporter that Walkman owners often saluted one another as they strolled around the city. It's just like Mercedes-Benz owners honking when they pass each other on the road. These stereotypes became even more clear as journalists directly juxtaposed the Sony Walkman and Boombox in their mainstream media coverage. A writer for the Wall Street Journal described the Walkman as the hottest new status symbol around and the middle and upper class answer to the box. New York Magazine wrote, "Blair is out and sonic privacy is in. The Walkman is the antithesis to those bulky blaring radios you hear everywhere." A journalist for the Washington Post referred to the Sony Walkman as the civilized answer to something that should be illegal, those 20-pound stereo boxes carried by young men with strong backs and bad manners. In New York City, subways, buses, parks, and other open urban spaces brought together groups of people crowded together in unusually close proximity. These situations bred the opportunity for unwanted noise, social interactions, or tensions between these historically stratified residents. The headphones of the pricey Sony Walkman offered the city's most privileged residents the ability to manipulate these shared spaces by shutting out the tensions of forced togetherness through carving out a personal, private soundscape. As historian Matthew Lasar notes, this was a remarkable moment, laced with racial and class tensions in which private listening was declared almost officially, culturally, and socially superior to public shared listening. These tensions were so prominent, they fueled enough anxieties to encourage the mayor of New York, conservative Democrat Ed Koch, to apply his law and order policing tactics to public spaces and the portable radio owners within them from the late 1970s well into the 80s. In conclusion, I argue that those same media outlets and advertising agencies whose publications reflected and shaped the racialized and classist stereotypes of the boombox were also the same institutions that informed and inflated the elitist perception of the Sony Walkman. Analyzing this media coverage is important because although the perceptions and policing of urban spaces and soundscapes have been explored in a wide spectrum of academic fields, scholars have less commonly explored how historically race and class have informed the perceptions of technologies, specifically portable audio technologies, within these diverse urban spaces. Building from the work of these scholars, especially UCSC's own Matthew Lasar, my work takes a closer look at the media coverage of boomboxes and compares it to that of Walkmans to better understand how the media reflected and shaped the social growing tensions within New York City's public spaces. My hope is that this critical comparison can compare to a new historical understanding of how the media's reshaped and reflect New Yorkers' relationship with race, space, class, and technology in the 1970s and 1980s. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you so much for being here today, and thank you for judging for the research symposium. I'm really excited to share my research with you. And I want to start out with a potentially startling fact, and that's that when we look out into the universe, everything that we know and love, so this includes stars, planets, atoms, the stuff that makes up you and me, this only accounts for about 20% of the matter in the universe. We know there must be a lot more out there. About 80% of the matter must be something invisible because we see its gravitational influence, but we don't see it directly. Since scientists don't know exactly what this mysterious substance is, physicists have creatively dubbed it dark matter. So I'm going to explain what we know about dark matter right now. What we know about dark matter is that it interacts through gravity. That's the only reason we really know it's there in the first place. We know it must be stable on very long timescales.
So we know it was around in the very early universe since it was essential for the formation of galaxies, but we still see its effects today, so we know that it's stuck around for a very long time. Lastly, we know it's invisible, and this is a tricky one because that fact makes it very difficult to learn any additional facts about dark matter. So for about a century, physicists have come up with crazy models with lots and lots of new particles to try to explain what the dark matter is. Unfortunately, we haven't seen any of these particles. So from my perspective, why don't we start with something that we already know is out there that meets these criteria beautifully? I'm talking about black holes. So I claim that black holes are a very natural dark matter candidate. I don't have to convince you that black holes have a lot of gravity. You know you shouldn't get too near one or you will never come back. We know they're stable on long timescales. In fact, they're among the most stable objects in the universe that we know of. And they're invisible because any light that gets too close to a black hole cannot escape its gravitational influence. So we can't directly see black holes. And although it meets these criteria for dark matter relatively well, for a long time it was thought that black holes couldn't be the dark matter, especially if they need to make up 80% of the matter in the universe. Wouldn't we see large black holes all over the place? Wouldn't they be sucking in stuff all the time? Well, that was true until it was discovered that if black holes formed in the very early universe, they can actually be very, very tiny. So I thought a while ago, what if the dark matter is just made up of lots and lots of these tiny black holes? And it turns out someone had thought this before me because someone actually looked for these and they didn't find any of them, which is really too bad because they were such promising candidates. But I still had hope. So I went to the research group that did this study that showed that they didn't see black holes. And I read it and I saw that they were missing a crucial element. So to explain what that element is, let's think about how this group looked for the black holes in the first place. So since these things are invisible and tiny, you might wonder how we look for them. And we look for them based on their influence of things that we can see. So in this example, stars. The collaboration looked at many, many distant stars, and they waited for a black hole to pass in front of them. So what would happen if a black hole did pass in front of a star is because the gravitational influence of the black hole is so strong, it warps space-time itself, and the trajectory of the light gets bent around the black hole. The black hole effectively acts as a lens, and it magnifies the star's brightness. So if you looked at a star and you saw that gradually the magnification increased and then subsequently decreased, you can be pretty sure that you've indirectly detected a black hole. So this collaboration looked for these things for a little while, and they didn't see very many. They said, okay, maybe there's black holes out there, but there aren't nearly enough to account for the dark matter. And they made a very strong claim that these light black holes can't make up the dark matter. So here's where the missing piece comes in. What we discovered is that there's an important feature called finite size effects. So what are these finite size effects? In short, the idea is, if a black hole is very, very small compared to the star that's magnifying, then only a fraction of the star gets lensed, and thus the net magnification is much, much lower than you would otherwise expect. So the old collaboration was looking for something like this red curve here. So they're looking for a very sharply peaked, large magnification. What we showed is by doing a thorough finite size treatment, which just means taking these effects into account, there'll still be magnification, but it'll be much dimmer than they had originally anticipated. And in fact, in general, it'll be much lower than their detection threshold for their instrument. So of course they didn't see these small black holes. Their instrument wasn't sensitive enough to detect them. So from this, we were able to show that the previously ruled out constraints on these black holes are in fact not valid at all. So it's still entirely possible that small black holes could make up 100% of the dark matter. And we showed that in a very, very large region of the parameter space, this is in fact a very good possibility. So while we're not particularly claiming that these black holes are 100% like with certainty the dark matter, they're a very promising candidate. They match the data exceptionally well, and now they're back in the running. In summary, I hope I've convinced you that black holes are very natural dark matter candidates and that they fit the data relatively well. The only strike against them really was that they were thought to have been ruled out because people didn't see them. But we showed by accounting for these important finite size effects, these small black holes can actually explain 100% of the dark matter. So with that, I'd like to thank you so much for listening. I'd also like to thank my collaborators, Stefano and Tesla from the physics department, Raja, who's a professor in the astronomy department, and his grad student, Kevin, and Sam English, who is an undergrad in the physics department, who also worked on this. And if you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them right now. So thank you so much for listening.
Thank you all for coming. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about some of my work examining the impact of non-binary and gender diverse characters on our attitudes and behaviors. And so we're seeing a lot of new children's television shows are representing non-binary and gender diverse characters. And what I mean here is characters that identify neither as men or women or boys and girls, and that are really gender expansive in their expression of their gender outside of the norms of the gender binary. And so why is that important? Why does it matter that there are new non-binary characters? And I'll argue that there are two big reasons. The first is that more and more kids are identifying as non-binary and gender diverse. And we know that if you have the opportunity to identify with a character that's represented positively, that's like you, it improves your self-esteem and self-efficacy. We also know that for non-binary children in particular, if we use appropriate pronouns, it validates their identity and increases their mental health outcomes. The second reason I think it's important that non-binary characters exist in kids' television is that previous research has shown that positive representation of girls and women, for example, can make us less sexist. And this may also be true for non-binary populations. And so I'm going to talk to you today about two children's shows. The first is Adventure Time, the second is Steven Universe. And I chose to do research with these two shows for a couple reasons. The first is that they're similar in a number of ways. So they're both fantasy series that are created explicitly for children. They have similar animation styles, and they also air on the same network. But these shows are also different in a number of ways that make for interesting comparison. So first, they differ in the number of non-binary characters that are in the show, as well as how those characters are represented. And then lastly, they differ in the level of non-binary gender theming is present in the content of the show. So considering these two shows, I was really interested in how shows with varying levels of gender diverse content could impact our attitudes and behaviors, and also if our own beliefs could influence or moderate, strengthen or weaken these types of media effects. And so I had 190 undergraduate participants in this study. They came into the lab, and first we gave them a survey to see what beliefs they already had about changing language and about sexism. And then they were randomly assigned to watch one of three shows, two of which I've already explained. And I also included a nature show as a control condition because that show has no non-binary content. After they watched the show, we asked them to give us a summary of the show. We told them that we just wanted to see what people remembered, but of course we were looking for something else. We actually analyzed those summaries for the types of language they were using around non-binary characters. And after they gave us a summary, we gave them another set of surveys on identifying sexist language and stereotypes. And so we did see that watching these shows could change people's attitudes. We saw an interaction effect between the show participants watched and the beliefs they already had coming into the lab. So some participants had less stereotyped attitudes after watching either Adventure Time or Steven Universe. And some participants were better able to recognize sexist language after watching Steven Universe in particular. But this was only the case for participants who already had progressive beliefs. So they already thought language should be less gendered and recognized that sexism was real. We did also observe changes in behavior. So we saw a main effective condition here, that people who watched Steven Universe, the show with the most diverse non-binary content, were more likely to use they, them pronouns toward non-binary characters. We also got to capture something interesting and exciting, in my opinion. In those summaries, we got to observe people actively thinking about their behavior and about what pronoun they should use. So here's a picture of the character Stevani, who is non-binary, being harassed by this character Kevin. And people would say things like, yeah, Stevani, she doesn't, Stevani doesn't really like hanging out with Kevin. And so they were really actively constructing and interpreting gender salient information, or the lack thereof, which really provides evidence that television consumption is not a passive process. And it's also not subject to the same effects for everyone. Our beliefs may actually influence these media effects. I also think this work tells us something interesting about this kind of experimental paradigm, because we found these effects after participants watched only one 20-minute episode, which is really remarkable. But it also makes me think about future work and if long-term exposure to these kinds of shows and characters might shift attitudes for people with more conservative beliefs. I'd also like to replicate this work in the future with children, since these shows are created for this audience, and also kids in early adolescence are really starting to become flexible in their thinking around gender. I'd also really love to work with media practitioners and content creators to make sure that this and future generations of children get to see diverse and dynamic and inclusive children's television. I want to thank you all for coming and everyone involved in this project, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining to learn more about my research. My name is Malia Kotas. I'm a master's candidate in coastal science and policy, and I have been working for the last year and a half on researching strategic retreat for resilient climate adaptation, and specifically the role for conservation organizations in this work. I've been partnering with the Nature Conservancy, the California and New York chapters. The one thing I want you all to take away from this is that moving out of nature's way strategically can have many benefits for nature and for people. Images like this of catastrophic flooding are all too common. We've seen them across the United States, ever increasing year after year as a result of climate change and the fact that so much of our urban development is in floodplains and along the coast. We have to adapt to climate change. And we are adapting in some ways. For some folks, climate change adaptation looks like this. This is a seawall in Galveston, Texas, that was unfortunately overtopped just a few years after it was built because the engineers didn't anticipate the amount of sea level rise that would have happened. And when engineered solutions like this fail, the results can be really catastrophic for the communities who have been placed behind them because we were counting on them to work. And so when I think of building walls in the face of climate change to keep water out, this image of Sisyphus comes to mind. And I overlaid it with the Mauna Loa Observatory CO2 graph just to really demonstrate that, you know, climate change is only getting worse. And if we keep building on walls, it's just like rolling a ball up the hill. We're bound to fail. At the same time, we know that nature can have a lot of benefits for communities in the face of storms or flooding. During Hurricane Sandy, studies have shown that wetlands along the coast prevented $625 million worth of damage to those communities during the storm. And the thing that gets me so excited about the work that I'm doing, I have a science background, but I decided to get a master's because I'm really interested in practical application of science, is that through the work that I'm about to tell you more about, we're applying what we know about science, healthy ecosystems, and promoting them to help society adapt to climate change. And so another way that we're adapting is through buyouts. Buyouts are one way that we get managed retreat to happen. So managed retreat is this idea of moving out of harm's way. Say, if you live in a floodplain and you've been flooded many, many times and you don't want to live there anymore, you might be like this house on Staten Island after Hurricane Sandy. Buyout wanted, buyout needed. They were asking the federal government to literally purchase and demolish their property so that they could move somewhere safer. So retreat is happening. It's been happening for many decades. That federal program has been running since the 90s, but it is so rarely actually strategic. In fact, most buyouts end up looking like this. They happen in a patchwork pattern, one here, one there. The house is removed, but often the foundation is left. And this empty lot surely isn't adding very much adaptive capacity to the surrounding neighborhood. It's definitely not absorbing much water. And if anything, it's decreasing property values, particularly when these empty lots are poorly maintained. And so when you think about conservation organizations, they're experts at a few things. land acquisition and restoration, policy advocacy, and community engagement. But usually these organizations are focused on preserving already pristine places. Like one of those organizations probably preserved the land that this is a photograph of. They're not really oriented to buy out flood damaged properties, particularly in urban environments. So I did a number of case studies to help the Nature Conservancy understand how conservation organizations have a role in strategic retreat and demonstrate and socialize this role. I'm going to tell you about a couple of them. One is Cascades Park, where previously an industrial waste site, it now is a 24-acre park with an amphitheater concert venue. And I love this because the amphitheater doubles as a stormwater storage facility during flooding. Wetlands Watch is a nonprofit in Virginia that has figured out mechanisms to get private capital from developers through a mitigation program to remove development rights in floodplains and coastal areas through rolling easements, which are a legal mechanism to prevent future development. And so through all of my research, I've been looking at partnerships, funding mechanisms, restoration strategies, and what policies we should advocate for to truly guide the Nature Conservancy's efforts across the US in engaging with retreat as an adaptation strategy. And so again, please remember that moving out of nature's way strategically can have many benefits for nature and for people. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for being here this afternoon. My name is Sharon Bock, Shea, and I'm a PhD candidate in the psychology department. My research is interested in leveraging psychological theory and data to improve criminal justice processes. I have a background in criminal law, and so I'm going to talk to you today about my current research, Satisfying the Urge to Punish, exploring strategies for increasing support for restorative justice practices. And by way of a little context, we are living in the era of mass incarceration. It's a well-known fact and something that there's no sort of bipartisan disagreement about. What that means is that we incarcerate more people in this country at a higher rate and for longer periods of time than any other country in the world. So the United States has approximately 5% of the world's total population, but 25% of their prisoners. There's currently about 2.1 million people in prisons and jails in this country, and that does not include people who are on parole or who have probation status or anything like that. This represents a 600% increase since the early 70s, when there was a rapid change in sentencing policy and law, as well as the politicization of criminal justice issues, where you had politicians really leveraging criminal justice issues in their political campaigns and using a lot of tough on crime rhetoric. And so acknowledging that this is a harmful situation that we're in, it's harmful for the people who are incarcerated. There's well-documented negative impacts of incarceration, as well as negative social impacts, economic impacts. It also doesn't reduce crime. It doesn't reduce recidivism. We need to rethink the way that we punish in this country. So that's why restorative justice represents a viable, promising alternative, because it's both a different process and a different meaning of justice, one that is not focused on punishment per se, but is more focused on repairing harm and restoring people. So really attending to the victim's needs as well. People do not go through traditional criminal justice processes, something you might be familiar with as going to a trial, getting sentenced by a judge, and then doing time in prison. Instead, they're diverted to a system where they have to confront the victims, the communities or the families of the victims, take responsibility for their actions, talk about their motivations, hear from the victim as well, and then ultimately come up with a plan for how am I going to make this right? How am I going to make you whole? So there's a lot of different elements that are not present in the criminal justice system that currently is most predominantly used, where the victim really gets a say in what happens and the victim gets to, feel more of a sense of closure. This brings me to the title of my presentation, which is Satisfying the Urge to Punish. The reason why this is so important, not just because it has better documented outcomes, there's lower recidivism rates for people who go through restorative justice processes, and victims feel higher senses of satisfaction. There's also this emotional component to restorative justice that can meet our urge to punish. And what I mean by that is there is a lot of psychological literature that documents that we have a deeply ingrained need to see justice done. And by that we mean, retributive urge to punish people who we see as having committed wrongdoing. It's important to acknowledge that punishment doesn't just serve a public safety function. It serves a symbolic, social, and psychological function. It reaffirms those of us who are law-abiding in the right. It's got a validating, soothing function, and it can ease anxiety not just about crime, but about other social ills. And oftentimes our instrumental concerns around safety and risk mask that symbolic need for feeling that, there's been some consequence for this wrongdoing. So taking these things together, what my research is really interested in doing is sort of saying, knowing that there's this urge to punish, how can we satisfy that punitive urge while still engaging in this sort of transformational reform using restorative justice that many people don't see as a form of punishment at all? How can we get the public on board with something that feels so starkly different from what we've been doing for the last century? So what I have done is a number of focus group studies with community members trying to understand what they know about restorative justice, what they think about justice in general, and specifically, what are their barriers to support for restorative justice, what would increase their support, and ultimately, can restorative justice satisfy their need for punishment? And what my research has found is that restorative justice is not considered punitive, and therefore it's seen as ineffective. So it's thought of as therapy. It's a form of therapy, it's a good thing, but it doesn't replace punishment. It doesn't meet our symbolic need for safety. So one comment I got a lot was, I'm sorry to say, but how will this keep my kids safe? And then related to that is the idea that criminals are these dehumanized others, these sort of worst of the worst people. So what about sociopaths, Charles Manson types? People brought up Charles Manson, which is a very old crime and not representative of crime in general in every single focus group that I conducted, which tells you something about the way that we view crime as a society. So given this, what are some strategies for increasing support? The first is really focusing on education, not just that restorative justice is out there and that it works, but how it works, really focusing on the details of what goes into the process so people understand that it is really difficult and it is more punitive to come face to face with someone. Focusing on social empathy and understanding people's circumstances, what the fundamental root causes of crime are to kind of disrupt some of that othering. So again, a telling comment, who are these people? I mean, who is it we're just going to let run around? And the answer is they're community members. They're people who live in our society, who are part and parcel of our communities, and to kind of reframe that. And then importantly, to rethink the way that restorative justice is framed. So right now it's really seen as this sort of utopian vision, kind of pie in the sky ideal, but it's actually something that we currently use in a number of jurisdictions. So again, back and forth, maybe you should rebrand it as restorative punishment. And then somebody else said, that would make me feel better, even though I followed up and said, but if nothing else changed. And she said, yeah, just the label itself. So really focusing on publicizing restorative justice as an existing option among a current set of punishments that we already use. And again, focusing on that emotional expressive aspect of restorative justice. And I realize that time is short, and so I'm going to end here, and I'll take any questions that you may have or any questions about the next steps with this research and where I hope to go with it. I'd be more than happy to answer.